Hey guys, it's Navonod on No Limit Hold. I'm ready to grade this quiz. It seems like a lot of you were looking forward to it. I got some emails. Sorry for the wait. I didn't realize I had emails until last night, and that's when I checked my channel and saw that I had some comments and thumb up and all of that. So here's the answers in grading. If you wandered onto this by mistake, there's a quiz. Go back and take it, and then come back to this video and join us. Okay, we talked about all this in the first video. Okay, so the grading system. Each question is going to be worth some number of points. Most questions are going to give you either 0 or 1 or 2, all the way up to 4 points. Maybe more, I don't remember. There might be one that's more than that. But some questions are so obvious, fundamental, and required for you to play decent poker that if you don't get them right, you're actually going to lose points. Okay, so this is going to be, I've done my best to try to quantify this and put numbers to it, but each section has 10 possible points. Section 1 basically is pass-fail. If you don't get, 80% right, then you should stop playing poker, start reading, and I don't mean this as an insult, I mean start reading some books. If you want to ask me, I'll give you some recommendations. Get on forums, ask questions, start posting things and reading things. And yeah, you need to get like these first, unless you just don't mind losing money while you're playing poker, if you don't get section 1, if you don't get the vast majority right, you failed. But Section 2 and Section 3 are a little bit different. Section 4 is not going to appear. It wasn't on the first video, and we're not going to grade it here then, obviously. But this is hard to quantify. It's not really going to be black and white or binary. It's going to, all this stuff is going to fall on a continuum, and you're going to have to gauge for yourself how well you think you did, how close you think you were. I'm trying to give you a nice, easy, kind of cookie-cutter way to do it. And you know what? If you email me your answers, I'll do the best I can for you to look it over, score it, give you some input, send it back, maybe advice on where to start. But one of the main reasons that I wanted to do this type of video, and I'm thinking I'm going to do more in the future, people seem to like them, is as a gauge for you to know when you're ready for coaching. That doesn't necessarily mean coaching from me, although I do, I am a little partial. I think I'm a pretty good teacher, and I don't charge an arm and a leg because I don't do it for a living. If I did get to the point where I was doing it for a living, at some point I'd probably have to charge a little bit more unless I had tons and tons of people. But hey, your first session is free, but until you're getting pretty much 100%, maybe at least 80-90% of Section 1 correct, and you're doing 8 plus, like 80% in Section 2 and 80% in Section 3. Until then, maybe there's other things you can do, and maybe it's not quite time for you to get a coach. But once you're in that ballpark, talk to me. I'll make it. I think I can definitely make it worth the money, and the first session's free. Okay, so Section 1, question number 1. You're in a local casino in a 1-2 game. The button opens pre-flop. You call with the ace of spades, 10 of spades. You're in the big blind. The flop comes out king of spades, queen of spades, and 9 of hearts. If you somehow knew, and I'm not suggesting that you do, I'm not suggesting that you can, I'm not suggesting that you try to narrow your opponent's range to exactly 2 hole cards, but if somehow you did know that your opponent had ace of clubs, king of diamonds, how many outs would you have to win the pot on the turn? And what I mean is, how many outs would give you a complete lock where your opponent was then drawing dead? And how many outs would give you the lead, but in a way that your opponent could either tie or win? He could either catch you or beat you on the river. So this is going to be, I don't know if I went over the points, but there's 10 points per section, and in this first section, this first question is just pass-fail. If you get it right, it's 2 points, and if you get it wrong, As long as you get most of it right, it's not a deduction. But if you get everything wrong, it's a -2. So your answer is going to be 12 outs to take the lead and 8 outs to lock it out completely. So what are the 12 outs? You've got 9 spades, but one of those spades is the jack of spades, and one of those spades is the 9 of spades. And the jack of spades, the reason I say that is because with the jack of spades we want to make sure we don't count it twice, because any jack is going to give us Broadway, and the jack of spades is going to give us the royal flush. But you don't want to count the jack twice. The jack of clubs is sufficient to take the lead. Well, it's actually sufficient to, take the lead. So you've got 12 outs to take the lead, 8 to lock it out. Remember that if your opponent if he pairs the board, and the only way your opponent can pair the board, the only way the board can pair on the turn that also gives you the flush is with exactly the 9 of spades. So the 9 of spades would give your opponent a redraw. You'd take the lead, but he'd have outs to a full house. And if you hit a jack that is not the jack of spades, you will take the lead, but your opponent can still make Broadway on the river to tie you. Okay, so there's your answers. 12 for the lead, 8 for the auto W on the turn. So section 1, question 2. Very simple. There's $40 in a pot. You're deciding whether to call a bet or not. The bet is $20 into a $40 pot. So that brings the total amount of money that you could win to $60, and it costs you $20 to attempt that win. So your immediate pot odds to call are simply 3-1, 60 to 20, or 3-1. Okay, questions 3 and 4. 3. What is meant by the term implied odds? And we're going to talk about this a little bit. 4 will be what is meant by the term reverse implied odds. So we're going to have a little bit of a talk here. Hopefully you learned something. I've got some notes. I'm going to try to run through this as fast as possible, but this is complicated. So, first of all, what implied odds is not. Okay, it's not equal to the amount of money that your opponent has in their stack. That's not what is meant by implied odds. It is also not the amount of money you could potentially win. Implied odds refers to the ratio of the amount of money you can expect to win on average for a favorable outcome divided by the amount of money that it costs you to attempt that, and modified by how frequently we expect that to happen. Expect the good thing to happen. So, it's the ratio of money you expect to win when you improve to the best hand to the percent that you can expect to win. It is pot plus bet plus future wagers divided by chance of getting that future wager or those future wagers called. Let's go post farm. If you add a bet to a pot, so somebody bets and you're thinking about calling, there's obviously a pot, then there's a bet. You add that pot to the bet, or add the bet to the pot. Then you add the future bets you're going to make divided by the chances of getting those bets called. You add bet to pot, determine what your appropriate bet sizing will be, and like if you're calling, if there's a $50 pot, you're calling a $20 bet. If you call 20 and you hit, let's say you've got the nut flush draw on the turn, there's one card left. So let's say that $50 pot, $20 bet, if you call $20 and hit, you're going to plan on betting $60 into what would then be a $90 pot. So you're going to be betting 60 into 90 if you hit. And you think that your opponent's going to call 50% of the time, half of his range is going to call, or just say that'll be the last $60. So if there's exactly $60 behind, you think he's going to call it off with half of his range, put the money in somehow with half of his range, then you can take the $60 you plan on betting, you can cut it in half, because remember, it's only getting called 50% of the time. so that leaves you with $30. Then move that $30 right back into the pot that you're determining whether or not you have a profitable call in. So that $50 pot with a $20 bet essentially then becomes a $50 pot plus a $20 bet plus the $30 of expectation you have on the river when you make your hand. So now you can look back at it and say, instead of calling a $20 bet to win what would be a $70 pot, now you can effectively think of it as a $100 pot and a $20 call, and your implied odds would be 5 to 1. $100 to $20. That's implied odds. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, ask a question and somebody will get to it, or I'll get to it. But maybe one more time. It is the size of the pot, and you can actually do this in game. If you see the pot size and you know what your odds of improving are, and you can figure out what the size of the pot's going to be if you make the call and win. If you make the call and hit your hand, if that's going to bring you to a pot size of, again, there's a $50 pot, $20 bet. So if you were to call, there'd be your 20 plus the 20 that was bet equals 40 plus the $50 pot is a $90 pot. If you hit your hand, you plan on betting $60 into 90. And if you bet $60 into 90, you expect your opponent to call with the top half of his range. Then you can count 50% of the $60 bet because you're going to win that $60 half of the time you make your hand. Then move that $30 of expectation back into the pot while you're figuring your pot odds. So you move that money back into the $50 pot, so that's 30 plus 50 plus the $20 bet equals $100, and you can play as if you are calling $20 to win $100 in expectation. So therefore, if your equity is greater than 20%, you can profitably call as long as you have done a good job of assigning your implied odds and picking your bet size and etc. But that's basically that's what we mean by implied odds. Pre-flop, it's a lot harder. Maybe you've got pocket threes. We've got this example down here. Pocket threes in the button, unknown villains. Okay, yeah, let's look at that kind of example. No, let's not, because that'll give something away. Pre-flop, it's harder. If you're thinking about making a $20 call at a 2-5 game with 100 big blind effective stacks, and the opponent that you're thinking about calling is a very loose, aggressive player, and he's opening from late position, and you figure, you're going to crush the board 20% of the time, and he's going to hit the board pretty hard about a third of the time, then to figure out your implied odds pre-flop, you've got to look, when you're trying to make one of these slam dunks with an implied odds hand, you have to figure, how much money am I going to make from this guy the 1/5 of 1/3 of the time that I crush the board and he hits a good second best hand? Where's that 1/5 of 1/3 coming from? Well, 1/3 of the time he's going to hit the board, and 1/5 of the time we've determined, whatever hand you have, you're going to crush the board about 20% of the time. He's going to crush the board, or he's going to hit the board in a very good second best way 1/3 of the time. So 1/5 of the time you hit the board, 1/3 of the time he hits the board. But you're playing a hand that if you hit the board, you're hitting it harder than he's hitting it, so that 1/3 of the time he makes a good hand, of the 1/3 of times that he makes a good hand, 1/5 of those times you make a good second best hand, brings you to 1 in 15 times that you're going to be in a very valuable situation. But without doing some off-table math and making some assumptions about ranges, things like that, it's hard to know really with any kind of certainty how much money you can expect to make in these sort of slam dunk best case scenarios. But you can start with saying, if there's a $20 bet and it gets called, maybe I'm in the big blind, there's $40 plus the $5 that'll be taken out in rake. there's about 40 bucks in the pot. My opponent will likely bet half pot. If I call, it'll be 80. If the turn then it has 80, and my opponent tends to bet half pot, he bets 40 into 80, and I'm going to raise him on the turn. Maybe I'm going to make it 120. If he calls the 120, that's going to bring the pot up to 80 plus 120 is 200 plus 120 is 320, and maybe then I can bet, I don't know, 250 say, on the river. If he calls, that's $500 in the pot plus the 320 that was already in it. Maybe I win an $820 pot, but I put half of that money in, so maybe I win a $410 pot, but I only win it, a big pot like this, when all the stars align just perfectly. You know, you may not have the right implied odds to even take a $20 set mine with 100 big blinds effective stacks against a decent player who's opening a wide range. Whereas, you know, if you're playing against a super nitty player that plays a very tight pre-flop game, but he's also bad at poker post-flop, so like maybe he's opening like pocket eights plus and ace king only from early position, you can see it's going to be a lot more likely that your opponent then is going to flop a big hand that 1 out of 5 times or whatever it is when you really get there, you really crush in some way, and you might be much more likely to stack him, but it might be the same cost, so your implied odds are going to be better because the upside is more valuable, the upside is just more likely, but the investment stays the same. But if you're not in that situation, if you're in a situation where some average or good or decent player opens from middle or late position, this can show you right here why all pocket pairs are not the same when you're thinking about taking making a call that is primarily a set money. Because maybe it turns out, and this could very well be the case, that the set mine itself is exactly break even or really close to break even, and if that's the case, then all of the value of your set mine really is getting generated from the times that you have pocket eights instead of pocket twos, and the flop comes out like 2, 3, 4. Well, bad example, 3, 5, 6, and you can call the flop bet profitably, and either you improve your hand on the turn, or your opponent checks and you bet he folds, or it goes check check and you bink the river. Whereas if you had a smaller pocket pair, most likely you're not going to be able to peel like ever. So, or if you're playing out of position, it's going to be harder for you to peel. So these are some of the reasons that the size of the pocket pair that you're set mining definitely matters, especially, and it matters more the wider your opponent's range is. If we're talking about that nit, that tight aggressive player opening from under the gun, it probably doesn't matter much if you've got pocket threes or pocket eights, because you're not going to be doing a lot of peeling on most flops anyway. Even if you have pocket eights, it's pretty much a pure set mode. Position is still going to be massively important because you can, get all the value that you're going to get from him betting his hand, and you can wait till the river to either raise his river bet or when he checks the river, you can bet. But if you're trying to get full value from a set out of position, at some point you're going to have to check raise with full stacks mostly. But getting back to the slide and getting back to the quiz, implied odds is the amount of money it costs to call compared to the average you win. So it's your risk-reward ratio. It is a ratio. Making a how do I say this? Making an argument for 3-betting your small pocket pairs. I've heard this. In fact, a guy that is really good at poker, that plays a lot of live, that I talk a lot with, is convinced that this is the case, and I can't quite seem to break through. He believes that he is actually increasing his implied odds when he 3-bets a hand like pocket sixes, because his opponent's going to continue with a stronger range. So he figures, I've got the bonus of folding some pre-flop, getting him to fold some pre-flop, and then I can c-bet with my uncapped range on the flop when he does call, and that stuff is true. And I increase my implied odds because there's going to be more money in the pot when I flop my set, and my opponent's going to have a stronger range on average. First of all, your opponent's not going to have necessarily a stronger range on average because once he just calls your 3-bet, he's capped, right? But secondly, you destroy your implied odds. You don't increase your implied odds because implied odds doesn't mean what's the most I can win. It is the ratio. It's how much I have to invest compared to how much my payoff is modified by how often this payoff happens. I'm going to let you grade yourself on that question, but the question is really, let's just give it somewhere between 0 and 3 points. However well you feel like you understood implied odds compared to what I just said, give yourself a score between 0 and 3. And number 4, reverse implied odds. Once we've discussed implied odds, which, again, implied odds, it's just the amount of money it costs to call compared to the average you win when you decide to call. It's outcome times probability by probability of outcome. Reward by probability divided by investment, or compared to investment. However you want to phrase it. It's expected return on investment compared to the investment. How much you believe you'll make on average compared to the cost of trying to make it. Any of those answers is going to be acceptable. Or if you have something that's in that ballpark, I'll leave it up to you to decide if you got that one right or wrong, or to what degree between 1 and 3 you did get it right or wrong. Okay. Reverse implied odds then. How much money are we going to lose in unfavorable and unexpected situations? Like, how likely is it going to be that we're the guy that flops a good second best hand? That's your reverse implied odds. All of these concepts of implied odds and reverse implied odds, all of it comes from the idea that when big pots are won and lost, it tends to be when both players have hands that figure to be best, but one of them's wrong. So reverse implied odds, it doesn't need really to be compared to our hopefully more likely scenario where we win a bunch of money. Understanding reverse implied odds allows you to adjust your expectations on the value of a hand by figuring in more or less the worst case scenario, estimating its frequency, and then subtracting that from what would otherwise be your profit expectation or your positive EV of a hand. So implied odds and reverse implied odds both deal with two players having hands that figure to be best, but one player is incorrect. They're really foundational pieces of this entire poker puzzle. They really, really are. Reverse implied odds, you could just say, is your worst case scenario, how much money you lose in your worst case scenario, and how likely your worst case scenario is. So instead of it being return on investment compared to how much you have to invest, instead of that it is how much of your profit is going out the window because you're spending a percent of your profit on times when you have made a good second best hand. Again, I'm going to let you grade yourself on that, but just call that 0, 1, or 2 points, depending on how well you feel like you understood reverse implied odds. An example would be you have a hand like King Jack, and you run it into a hand like King Queen. Or an example would be you have a hand like King Jack, and the tight player has made an open raise. You have to think about, if I call and flop top pair, which is going to be a favorable situation, how much money do I stand to lose in this situation, and how often do I expect it to be the case? So the reverse implied odds of hands often deters us from playing hands that would otherwise be profitable if, for instance, stack sizes were smaller, or if we could see our opponent's hand. Or if our opponent plays very face up. So I'm having a hard time sticking to just the pure question answer part of this. Hopefully you enjoy that. Hopefully that's not a problem. Hopefully that's not a bad thing. So let's move on. Okay, so section 1, question 5, you're playing online at a $5 6-max cash game, contemplating taking a set line. Okay, we just talked about a lot of this, but you had to answer this before we did, so that should be fine. You have pocket threes on the button, and an unknown villain raises to 20 cents for middle position. Of all of the relevant factors that you don't have, I just described part of a scenario to you, you don't know the rest of it. What's the number one most important piece of information that you need and you don't have to determine the EV of that set mine? Okay, the relevant factors include your table image, villain's table image, the players in the blinds, their calling frequencies, their squeezing frequencies, your opponent's post-flop aggression, his post-flop stickiness, like, is he going to have a hard time folding top pair? Is he going to have a hard time stacking off? But the number one thing, and this is simply a pass-fail question, the number one thing you have got to know in order to determine whether you even might have a potentially profitable set mine, stack sizes, effective stack sizes. That is the answer. It is the only answer. No more ambiguity here. 2 points if you got it, 0 points if you didn't. It is effective stack sizes. Okay, now let's move on to the good stuff. Here we go. We're going to get into section 2. Determine, this is where my notes really become effective, I hope. Man, really bad handwriting. Here we go. Alright. Section 2, question 1. How would you determine the EV of the following scenario? On the flop of King 8, 2, with 2 hearts and a diamond. You have the Ace of Hearts and the 7 of Diamonds. Your opponent moves all in for $500 into a pot that contained $500 prior to his shoving. If you assume your opponent has Ace of Clubs, King of Clubs, how do you estimate the EV of calling the bet? Okay, so I'm looking for an estimate. I'm looking for something you can do in-game. Now, you can just look at it like this. It's $500 in the pot plus a $500 bet is $1,000, and it costs you $500 to call. 1,000 by 500 is 2 to 1. So you are getting pot odds of 2 to 1. You have 9 outs, and if you think of it, I think it's useful to think of it like this. If the deck had 100 cards in it, and you had 9 outs, your percent would be exactly 9%, because percent means per 100. So there's about 50 cards left in the deck, so you can about multiply your outs by 2. But there's slightly fewer cards than 50, so you can add a little bit to it. You can take the 9 outs, multiply it by 2, add a couple points, and say that with 1 card coming, you're about 20%. 9 times 2 is 18, plus 1 is 19, or plus 2 is 20, but it's going to be round about 20, round about 4 to 1. That breaks down a little bit as you try to use, if you try to count multiple streets, and especially the more outs you have, the less effective that formula is. But it's close enough, and it's close enough to call this about 36%. Really, you can just call it roughly 2 to 1, and you're getting 2 to 1, and if you're getting 2 to 1 pot odds, and you have about, a 1 in 3 chance of winning, so the odds are 2 to 1 against you winning, it's probably enough to know that that's roughly a break-even call. You can estimate 2 to 1. You're going to lose $500 each time you lose. You're going to win $1,000 each time you win. And so 500 plus 500, or really 500 minus 500. Minus 500 plus minus 500 is the losses. That's going to happen 2 times out of 3. The 1 time out of 3, you're going to win $1,000. So that would be 1,000 minus 1,000 equals 0. Divided by trials of 3 still just equals 0. Now, if you did more than that, and you made an attempt to really figure out the problem, you took the ratio of non-winners to winners, that's obviously going to be a better, more accurate way to do it off table. Might not be quite as efficient when you're in game, and you're going to come up with pretty close to the same results. I did the math both ways, and it's a little different because we are getting kind of up there in terms of outs, but it really is enough to count your outs and multiply by 2 per card. I mean, that really is, once you round it to a ratio, which you're going to generally want to do when you're comparing it to the pot odds to see if you're an overlay, then you're going to just think about it in money lost when you lose, plus the money won when you win, and compare that to the equity ratio, right? So, and then you're going to compare the total wins to total losses, and divide by the number of trials it takes to get you there. So another example, this might be a better example. $500 pot, $250 bet. Okay. So now there's 750 total you can win, 250 to call. You're getting 3 to 1. You're about a 2 to 1 dog, so you're going to win about. You have that same flush draw. I'm just changing the bet size. $500 pot, $250 bet means you're getting 750 to 250, which is the same as getting 3 to 1, and you're on about a 2 to 1 shot. So you definitely have overlay, and if you have overlay, you have a plus EV scenario. Oftentimes, it's enough just to compare your pot odds to your equity. If you convert them both to ratios and say, okay, I only need 2 to 1, and I'm getting 3 to 1, this is a call because I definitely have overlay. But to figure out exactly how much value there is there, or ballpark it, then what you need to do is take the amount of money that you're going to win, which in this case is $750, and how often you're going to win it, which in this case is 1 time for every 2 times you lose. Then you're going to take the amount of money that you lose, which is $250, by the number of times that you're going to lose it, which, since we have a 2 to 1 ratio, we're going to say we're losing $250 twice. For every 1 time we win $750, and then we just take $750 that we're going to win, we subtract the $500 that we're going to lose, we come up with a total of $250 profit. Divide that by 3, and that gives you your actual value, your EV in dollars on every call that you make. I did some more math here. I think this is going a little bit longer than I thought it was going to. But basically, outs times 2 per cards coming can't be too awful bad. Once you convert it to a ratio, you plug the dollars into the equity, and you just solve the calculation that way. I'm going to count on you to judge whether or not you got that right again, but here we go with question 2. Now, if you were way off base with this first question, if you really did not know how to figure this out at all, -5. And even if you were perfect at it, it's only +1, because this is prerequisite information. If you don't understand this at all, drop 5 points off your score. You've got a chance for bonus points. I said each section was worth 10 points. I didn't say you could only get 10 points, but we're scoring all of this against 10 points being like good. Okay, 10 points being great, really. Section 2, question 2, what is meant by the term pot geometry? This ought to be a little bit easier and more straightforward. Okay, so pot geometry. Pot geometry refers to the way that pots grow from one street to the next in big bet poker. Well, in any form of poker, I guess, but especially in big bet poker. Again, pot geometry refers to the way pots grow from one street to the next, especially when we're sizing our bets in proportion to, or based on a percentage of the pot on each street that we bet. So, +1 for the answer. +1 if you could give me an example right now. If you could give me an example of how much you would need to bet on the turn to get stacks in on the river by betting all in on the river, betting a similar percent on the flop, on the turn, on the river. If you feel like, or if you really want to try this, if you feel like you could figure out even less complicated than that, if I gave you a pot size, I'm going to. Here's the pot size, $50. Remember this, because this might be something that comes up in section 4. The pot size is $50. If you bet 50% of the pot on the flop, 50% of the pot on the turn, and 50% of the pot on the river, what is the biggest sized stack you can get in by the river? Okay, so pot geometric growth refers to this type of growth. So the +1 for the answer and +1 if you think you really understand it, and you could figure out how much to bet on the flop, turn, and river given some stack size that you're trying to get all in by the river, assuming that you get called on all 3 streets. Question 3. If there's $100 in a pot and you have $300 left in your stack, and your opponent has you covered with $600 in his stack, what's the SPR? So first thing is, what is SPR? SPR refers to stack to pot ratio, but it only counts effective stacks. So this was kind of a trick question. If you have $100, or if there's $100 in the pot, if you've got 300 and your opponent has 600, it doesn't matter what your opponent has. It just matters who has the smallest stack. The smallest stack in this example is your stack at $300. So the stack to pot ratio is going to be how much money we're playing for in effective stacks compared to how much money is in the pot right now. $100 in the pot, 300 in effective stacks. We have an SPR of 3 to 1, or simply an SPR of 3. Okay, moving on to question 4. Question 3 was only worth 1 point, by the way. Okay. Question 4. Villain is a competent lag. Now we're getting into it. Who plays at an expert level. You know he frequents several prominent poker forums. He creates video content. He's a badass. He's really good at poker. You know this. You know who he is. You know he's laggy and good and competent and all of that. He's got a name for himself. And right now you're playing 7-handed. You're on the button. You're the chip leader with over 150 big blinds. Your opponent, this nasty villain of yours, is second in chips with 100 big blinds, and everyone else is effectively tied for third place, holding between 9 and 13 big blinds apiece. So, we are playing 100 big blinds effective, right? Firstly, should you have a 3-bet range? The answer is yes. You definitely should have a 3-bet range. Okay. Even if you 3-bet and get it in and lose, you're still very much alive in this tournament, right? Did I do my math right? You are... Yeah, I mean, you're 50 big blinds. Third place has 13 big blinds, so there's not that much ICM to consider. And I would say this far from the button, with that ICM situation, ICM probably doesn't even really come into play very much, if at all. I mean, not much at all. I guess it always comes into play somewhat, but it's not a big deal here. So, yeah, that's not going to come in as much as it might seem. Now, if 3-betting and folding would put you below another player, then we could talk about that. We could consider the ICM considerations. If we were really close to the bubble, like a couple of places, or especially right on the bubble, if getting it in would be catastrophic, then these things could definitely deter us from 3-betting, or at least change our 3-betting range. If we didn't have room to 3-bet and then fold, then we might only want to ever 3-bet as a jam. That might or might not be an overbet, and that's going to cause some different things. If we were out of position, that might even cause us to want to be a little bit cautious. But here, we are in first chip position. We have position on the opponent. We're deep enough to 3-bet, then fold. We're deep enough to force our opponent to either 4-bet a sizing that lets us 5-bet all in with fold equity, or we force him to make a really big overbet jam with his 4-bet. We don't allow him to do anything good. This is a great spot to have a 3-bet range. If you answered no, I really want you to think about this. Okay, so now that we know the answer is yes, how could we construct it? How should we construct this 3-bet range? And, well, okay, villain is pretty likely good enough to know that flatting 3-bets out of position is usually a bad idea. Most good players try to really limit how often they're flat calling 3-bets out of position, because flat calling 3-bets is almost always bad. And he probably knows 4-betting a normal size would allow us to 5-bet shove a polarized range and a well-balanced range, really I should just say a wide range, that's going to be effective. It's going to cause him to really, if we 3-bet, and then he 4-bets some kind of normal amount, and we ship it in his face, he's going to puke with, like, everything but aces and kings, right? Everything with, if he's sitting there with queens, he's gonna vomit in his mouth, and, you know, I mean, there's all these players that are about to bust out of the game. He's in a very tough spot. 3-betting him puts him in a very, very tough spot. So if 3-betting puts our opponent in a terrible spot, and we expect him to recognize it, then what should we do a lot of? We should do a lot of 3-betting. We should be 3-betting a lot, and our range should be super polarized. This is one spot where we really want to go crazy with the polarization, because one, we only need a couple of hands to value 5-bet, and we can still create a really good wide 5-bet range. So we can plan to have whatever our 5-bet range would look like. We can plan on having it basically super premium hands, like ace, ace, king, king, and then, you know, some number of other hands to put in there for balance, like maybe some hands with blockers and good race equity, but that aren't good enough to flat call. So in this spot, then, we can 3-bet for sure. We can 3-bet a wide range because we can play very well against our opponent's 4-bets. Our opponent can't play very well against our 5-bets, obviously, and our opponent can't play very well against our 3-bets. So we can 3-bet wide because we can play well against his 4-bets, and we can be very, very polarized and very bluff heavy because villain is at a disadvantage. Because we want to call with many of our medium to strong hands, because we don't expect villain to flat call, maybe ever. And if he's not going to flat call us, then it doesn't make much sense to waste perfectly good flat calling hands that we don't want to stack off with, or that we don't want to shove all in with if we do get 4-bet. So if we just take all the hands that we want to 5-bet jam, and then enough other hands that we're going to 3-bet and fold to a 4-bet, and then you flat the middle of your continuing range, that's going to be probably exactly right. So, and if it's not exactly right, there's some ways that you could maybe convince me based on the way you want to construct your 5-bet range that you could construct your 3-bet a little bit different, your 3-betting range a little bit different than this. But I'm going to give you 1 point if you said no, you should not 3-bet, but you can explain to me why you believe that, and it's a pretty good reason. But really it's a yes. So 1 point for a yes, just if you said yes, we should have a 3-bet range. 1 point for it being polarized, an additional point for it being wide, and 1 more point for it being bluff heavy, or balanced, or anything but value heavy. Okay, so if you said that we should have a 3-betting range, 1 point. If you said it should be polarized, that's another point. If you said it can be very wide, that's another point. And if you said it should be bluff heavy, that's another point. Or if you said we should balance it, you can get a point for balanced or a point for bluff heavy. That's a stylistic situation. You know, it's how much variance do you want to trade off the EV. But probably the max exploitive adjustment in a situation like this, where you're playing a tournament against a guy who plays really good and understands ICM and understands the terrible situation that he's in, is going to be to open a very wide 3-bet range, and to not be at all worried if he decides to combat that by 4-betting, because you can 5-bet very effectively. So the answer is yes, wide, bluff heavy, polarized. That's we want to think of all the hands that we're going to 5-bet. We're not going to think of all of them as value hands once we decide to 5-bet them. But when you're trying to work out your ratios and work out which ranges are going to do what on what streets, you really want to look at all the hands you're going to 5-bet as value hands when you're working out your 3-bet range. So you take all the hands you're going to 5-bet, you put those on the value end, even the ones that you're hoping for a fold with, even the worst of your 5-bet hands when you're working on your 3-bet range, the worst of your 5-bet hands still count kind of as value hands because you're going to be able to make them plus EV when you shove them. If you can make them plus EV by shoving them as a 5-bet, then they count as value hands the way that you should be figuring out your ranges in terms of what hands should be 3-bet and what hands should be called with or folded. So take all of the hands you're going to 5-bet, count those as value, and then add enough hands that for balance that we want to use to 3-bet that are going to fold to a 4-bet, and then flat call the middle. So, I know that's a lot to get your head around, but really just in the interest of moving on and getting your score wide, bluff heavy, polarized, but definitely yes, definitely do have a 3-bet range. I'd love to hear why you should. If you think you can talk me out of it, I'm all ears. Okay, question 5. We're at another sit and go with the same villain. This time we're much, much deeper. We've got 500 bigs. Villain has 650, so we're playing 500 effective. That's a lot of big blinds. Now the other players each have between 3 and 50 big blinds, and our opponent has us covered this time. The small blind has 7 big blinds to start the hand. Play is again 7-handed for this example. Action folds to that same villain, and this time he's on the button. And he raises to 2.5 times the big blind, and the small blind fold. Action's on you in the big blind. Now explain the composition of your 3-bet range, why it's composed that way, or if you should even have a 3-bet range. So again, should you have a 3-bet range, and if so, what does it look like? Now here in question 5, we are playing very deep, out of position against a competent opponent. If we 3-bet some and flat some, then what we're going to do is we're going to cap our flat calling range. It's going to be capped. If we're going to 3-bet aces and kings and all that stuff, but we decide in this particular hand to flat call, our opponent knows that we're capped, and he can smash us for it, especially in a tournament format, especially when he's got position, and especially when we're super deep. So if we choose to 3-bet some hands and flat other hands, our flat calling range is capped, and our 3-bet range is either going to be, it's going to be easy to play against no matter what it is, because there's only 2 main ways that we can construct a 3-betting range. We can either polarize it or we can merge it. So if we have a flat calling range and we make our 3-bet range linear, now we're completely face up. Our opponent knows that when we 3-bet, we've got a big hand, and when we flat call, we have a not big hand. And that's going to make it way too easy for him to utilize his positional advantage, especially when we're this deep, and the penalty for busting out is so severe. He can really put a lot of pressure on us. So the other thing we could do is we could polarize. But if we're going to flat call some stuff and then we're going to 3-bet a linear range, then we just make all of our plays to face up, both with our flat calls and our 3-bets. And we're doing that against a player who can hand read, who will apply pressure post-flop. And we're doing so when we 3-bet, we're bloating the pot, but we're not bloating the pot enough to diminish his positional advantage. We're just bloating the pot enough to make it suck as bad as it can for the player that's out of position. See, most of the time when you make a 3-bet, you're taking the stack-to-pot ratio down to a degree that matters. And the smaller the stack-to-pot ratio is, the harder it is for the player that's in position to utilize that positional advantage. But when we're very deep, then 3-betting just bloats the pot, but it still doesn't create a stack-to-pot ratio that stops him from really wielding his positional advantage to maximum effect. So it's really just bad, if we can't diminish his positional advantage drastically, that's not going to be good. It's not going to be good to 3-bet. Just bloat a pot up to play out of position with a face-up range against a player who's good. If we polarize our 3-bet range, then first of all, our flat calling range is still capped, And now we're not going to be as face up with our 3-betting range, but we're going to be 3-betting a bunch of garbage when we expect to get called a lot. So basically, by putting in a bunch of bluffs in our out of position 3-bet range when we're playing really deep, we're going to be bluffing, and we're going to be getting called because our opponent's good, he's in position, and good players don't like to fold to 3-bets in position, especially when they're super deep. So if he's a very good player, and if we're very deep, and if we're out of position, we don't want to 3-bet bluff, get called, and have to play a big bloated pot out of position in a situation like this. And if we, I mean, in general, the more often you're getting called, the less often you should polarize, and the more often you should be playing a linear range. But, yeah, and this is definitely no exception to that. Even if this was a cash game, okay, even if it were a cash game and we took out all the stuff about ICM and how much pressure he can put on us because he's the only player at the table that can stack us, and we're playing very deep and he's in position, even if we took the ICM stuff out, I would still think the right answer would be to simply never 3-bet, not have a 3-bet range. Again, because then we cap our flat calling range and we turn a linear 3-betting range face up, or we are going to have too many bluffs and get called and play big bloated pots out of position with garbage hands. Neither one of those options are attractive. The addition of relevant ICM pressure from the tournament payout structure just makes 3-betting that much worse, especially when there is room for villain to 4-bet real small and then cause us to either have to overcommit to a huge 5-bet jam or 5-bet and allow villain to 6-bet with fold equity. And because he'll be able to 6-bet wide, because he'll be able to flat call, he'll be able to 6-bet polar, and he'll be able to do this effectively against us if we make a 5-bet that we can 5-bet and fold against. So really, there's no points here for 3-betting unless you can convince me. So if you've got a good, this is probably about as controversial as anything that I've said on here so far. So I'd love to hear the arguments, or just if you've got questions. I know this is complicated, it's not straightforward, it's not intuitive. I'm pretty sure about this, but I'd love to discuss it with you. My test, though. So, no points for 3-betting anything, unless you can convince me. Plus 1 point for having no 3-bet range, and plus 1 if you thought about or considered or came up with the rationales of ICM being a reason, that it caps our flatting range is another plus 1, that 3-betting linear leaves us face up as a point, that 3-betting polarized means it will be flopping with a bunch of crap out of position against a good player, that's a point. If you thought that it was bad to bloat a pot without taking away from our opponent's positional advantage, because we can't manipulate the stack to pot ratio, that's a point. And that it lets villain 6-bet profitably against us. Yeah, we'll even give you a point for that. If you came up with all of that, that's 5 points. Okay, word it now. Oh, hell yeah, you could get up to 7 points. Okay, so last section. Here we go. These are quicker. We'll move these right along. Section 3, question 1. You're just going to get points or not for these because this is practical application, man. You're playing heads up. Your opponent, an unknown villain, opens hand number 1. You're 75 big blinds deep playing a $10 heads up sit and go. Hand number 1, villain raises the 2 big blinds on the button, and your hand is the Queen 9 of diamonds. You've got Queen 9 suited. Should you call, should you fold, or should you raise? This is the most standard flat call in the world. For sure, this is just a call. So the answer, right or wrong only, is 2 points if you got it right, and the answer is call. It's a super standard flat call. We're rarely going to dominate anything that calls our 3-bet if we 3-bet. We won't fold out any better hands. We're not going to get called by worse very often, and our hand has just a lot of, it flops very well. It plays better in a large stack to pot ratio scenario, and getting 4-bet would be a disaster. So for all of those reasons, +2 for a flat call. Alright, question 2. You decided to just call. Good decision. The flop comes out Queen 7-2, Queen of clubs, 7 diamonds, 2 of spades, Queen 7 deuce rainbow. Do you lead into the pre-flop raiser or check down? Okay, so at $10 especially, but I think in general, poker players continuation bet too often. And if you knew your opponent was going to c-bet, you would literally never donk bet. So if you think your opponent is going to c-bet more often than he should, in true GTO terms, anytime your opponent is doing things a little bit more often than he ought to, your adjustment to that should be a binary adjustment. So as long as you're playing against a player, or in this case you're in a field, you have a player pool of players that c-bet too often, and I'm telling you, at $10 heads up sit and goes, to just about guarantee any site you're playing on, the player pool c-bets too often. So as long as they're c-betting too often at all, you should literally never need to donk. So when your opponents are c-betting too often, you should donk bet less often. And by less often, I mean not at all. Okay, can you donk bet some of the time? Yeah. I think there still are occasions when it can make sense to donk, but I don't do it. I mean, I experiment with it a little bit here and there, but as a general rule, it's not part of my general game plan. Once I see that my opponent's good and thinking, and he's 3-betting a lot, and we have this 3-bet, 4-bet thing going on, or we're just both 3-betting a lot or folding a lot, both especially, like, against players that are just flat calling from, when you min-raise the button, they're just flat calling out of the big blind, and you feel like you've got a post-flop skill edge, so you're doing a lot more flat calling and a lot less 3-betting or folding, then your equities are really pretty similar. So it doesn't really make sense that one flop would be so much better for your range than your opponent's range, enough so that you should be leading that flop. And even if you do have a well-established 3-bet game going on, and you know your opponent's perfectly capable of folding crap hands to an open raise, he knows you'll fold, and you both know in this case, he knows that you will 3-bet some hands. Even if you have this 3-bet thing going on, you've got a 3-bet game established. Queen 7 deuce would never be, Queen 7 deuce offsuit especially, would never be a flop that you should lead as a donk bet if you're donking only when the flop really hits your range harder than it hits your opponent's. And this is a flop that we can just expect our opponent to c-bet all of his air on. Most players will c-bet all their air, and they will definitely c-bet worse hands for value than the hand that you have. Like any worse queen, they're good 7s, so this is a check for sure. So, question 3. In the actual hand you check, villain bets 3 big blinds into the pot. What's your play? Are we check calling, check raising, or check folding? This is the clearest check call to ever happen in all of poker. So, very clear flat call pre-flop, a very clear check to the raiser, and I think this is a very, very clear check and call because we don't mind allowing our opponent to continue bluffing. So if he's c-betting as a bluff and he's going to barrel, we don't want to talk him out of it by raising him. So we just check and call, keep his bluff range intact. It's our best shot at getting 2 streets. If he has like a worse queen, or if he has a 7, or like a pocket pair of 9s, all that stuff is probably very much in his range. All that stuff is totally in his range. So if he has a hand like A7 or pocket 9s, our best chance to get 2 streets of value is going to be to check and call him on the flop, and if he checks back the turn, we can lead the river, or we can check call flop, check call turn, and he'll likely check back the river with like any of his 7s, and probably by that time, if he still has some weak queens, there won't be many queens he can beat, because if he's got a queen that our queen 9 beats, then that means the board will have come out like 2 cards lower than a 9. So if he has like, queen 8 and didn't make 2 pair, he's going to be about out of queen X hands that he can beat. So he'll likely check that back. But our best chance to get 2 streets of value out of 7x or bad queens or pocket nines is going to be to check, call. When villain checks the turn back, we lead. If he bets again, we call, and then we check to him again on the river. So we checked, he bet 3 big blinds. The play is simply to call for sure. Definitely 100%. Okay, question 4. You're playing on Bovada Zone, an anonymous fast fold site. If you've not played, I'm sure you've seen me play it. Well, you've probably seen me play it. It's just like any of the other fast fold games, but it's anonymous, so you can't track stats on anybody. You have no heads-up display. It just simply doesn't work. Every single game you play, every single hand you play in an utter vacuum. There's a few things you might get onto, like stack sizes of players and things like that, but mostly you're just playing every game in a vacuum, and most of the players are going to have full stacks and not much more. So let's assume here that we don't have any information, because we can't. You're in cutoff with the King Jack, King of Clubs, Jack of Diamonds, King Jack offsuit. The player to your immediate right open limps. What's your play? So are you overlipping, are you folding, or are you ISO raising? This is like a slam dunk ISO raise. Definitely an isolation raise here, and +2 for that. If you didn't ISO it, this is one time in section 3 you're getting -2. Take 2 points away for not ISOing this. There's never been a more valuable ISO on the face of existence. Bit of an exaggeration, but really, this is a slam dunk ISO raise. Remember, when he open limps, that means nobody else has come into the pot. He's in late position. He's opening with a limp. That means 2 things right away. Number 1, he's bad at poker. Number 2, he's probably got a weak hand. King Jack smashes the range of hands that I would expect to open limp. Oh wait, question 5 is why. Okay, so here we go. I'll explain my rationale for why. Okay. So in a few words, you could say, why would we want to ISO this? A few words: domination, fold equity, and position. But also, King Jack is going to frequently hit flops. It's going to hit, top pair with a really good kicker as often as any other hand will. You're in position. You have a hand that doesn't really want to go multi-way. You have a hand that you don't want to get isolated yourself. But the biggest thing, the thing that I think makes this such a slam dunk, is when bad players limp in, a lot of their range is going to be Jack X hands. Weak players love to limp Queen Jack suited, King 10 suited, stuff you dominate. King 10 suited, maybe King 9 suited or King 8 suited, but definitely Queen Jack, Jack 10, Jack 9 suited, maybe Jack 8 suited. All of those hands are in really bad shape. When they limp, you ISO, and they call. I mean, most of the time, the flop's going to just come out and miss them. They're just going to check. You're just going to bet. They're just going to fold. But you dominate so many of the hands that might limp in and then call from a bad player that when you do flop top pair along with them, you've built a pot, and you've got a really good chance of getting 2 or 3 streets of value. So that is question 5 in section 3. That question was also worth 3. Well, the question 4 part, just the question, was worth 2, and question 5, the explanation, is worth up to 3 points. And give yourself 1 point for mentioning either domination or frequent strength flopping. They're both they're connected. Give yourself another point if you mentioned fold equity. And give yourself a 3rd point if you mentioned either position or not wanting to go multi-way or not getting ISO'd. So 1 point if you mentioned either frequent strength or domination. 1 point if you mentioned fold equity, either pre-flop or post-flop or both. And another point if you talked about not going multi-way with a hand that does best heads up, not getting isolated yourself, or position. So there you have it. That's the results, or that's the scoring. Total your points up. If you got, I would say, a grand total of 26 points to 30 points, not only are you doing real well and ready to get some coaching, but you're not too good for it. If you went over 30, so you're like in extra credit land, maybe you don't need me as a coach. Maybe you've, at least at this point, you've not seen anything that would convince you that you need me as a coach. So wait and see if I put out some more of these videos. And it doesn't mean that you couldn't use a coach, but it means you shouldn't probably be playing micro stakes unless you're doing it kind of like I do it to film videos or whatever. And if you did decide to get a coach, you might be better off getting a coach who's a little bit better than I am. But if you're somewhere in the ballpark of like 26 points or a little bit, like I would say in the ballpark of 24 to maybe 28 points. Remember, Section 1 is 10 points. Section 2, you can actually earn more than 10 points on Section 2, but I'm calling 10, like, if you have 10 points, you get a 10 out of 10. So, because there's, like, extra credit to make up for the fact that you can lose points and whatnot. Just the way that I kind of decided to do it. If you got all of Section 1 right, or most of it right, maybe you missed one, and you got somewhere between 6 and 9 in Section 2, and somewhere between 6 and 9 on Section 3, I think you're ready for coaching, and I hope you talk to me about it. But I'm definitely willing to answer questions, and it doesn't have to be like any kind of like set in stone coaching arrangement. I enjoy doing it. So look, hopefully this is still within time limit to be able to put it on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, guys, good luck.